Welcome, everybody. My name is Theo Nath. Thank you all very much for joining today. I am the CEO and co-founder of Right Hand Cybersecurity. And today I will be your host for today's webinar to discuss the role of cyber culture in a cyber strategy. Today's webinar is organized by Right Hand Cybersecurity to help evangelize Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is an initiative that happens every October. For those that don't know, Cybersecurity Awareness Month started back in 2004 by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and also the National Cyber Alliance. And the mission behind this initiative was to help empower people to operate more safe online. And over the last decade and a half or so, Cybersecurity Awareness Month is popular, and today it's actually being recognized by companies and governments all over the world. So we're very excited to help promote this great initiative even further today. During today's webinar, we're expecting a diverse audience. We're going to have some cybersecurity leaders, cybersecurity practitioners, current and aspiring cyber entrepreneurs, and others who just want to hear and learn from our two amazing speakers and CISOs that we have, Jack and Matthew. So at point today, if you have any for yourself or for Jack or for Matthew, please go ahead, enter those questions in the Q&A forum below in the Zoom, and we will do our best to work through those questions as best we can. All right. So without further, we can dive in. It's my pleasure to introduce you and Jack, two cybersecurity thought leaders who bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise to the table to share about the role of cyber culture in a cyber strategy. Jack and Matthew, welcome, and thank you for joining today.
Great to be here.
All right. We'll go ahead and just start with quick introductions, and I'll start with you. If you could quickly just tell our audience here a little bit about your experience and background and your role today as a CISO.
Go ahead, Jack.
Oh, that's me. I'm Jack. I'm the Chief Security Officer at Turnitin. I've been working in the security industry for about 25 years, and I've held various roles. I do DevOps and security, so I like to couple the two teams and do that shift left DevSecOps thing that everybody's talking about, that everybody hates, especially my DevOps team. But I've worked in a diverse set of companies across many industries. I have a lot of experience in advertising and a lot of experience in education. Currently at Turnitin, we manage a very large repository, 1.5 billion submissions of extremely sensitive data coupled with data that is not very sensitive. So we have a lot of unique security challenges at Turnitin, and one of those is culture, because everybody at Turnitin needs to contribute to security. There are areas of security around our entire business that if they had deficits would cause severe vulnerabilities in our infrastructure.
Welcome, everybody. Matthew Rosenquist. So I'm a CISO and a cybersecurity strategist. I've been in the field for a little over 30 years, doing everything from operations, so building security operations center, running it, so on and so forth. I was with Intel as a cybersecurity strategist for about 24 years, a little more than 24 years. And I advise and consult out to the industry, out to academia, out to businesses of all sizes, and even governments around the globe in regards to emerging threats and best practices and really managing the cybersecurity risks. So happy to be here. And this is a great conversation because it's something that doesn't get enough airtime. Everybody tends to focus on really technologies out there, which is important, but the behavioral aspects is crucial, and the industry is starting to see that more and more. So it's great to have a conversation. It's great to be here in October.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Jack. So just to kind of frame the conversation for today, I think a good place to start, if each of you could maybe just frame to our audience, how would you describe your top three objectives as a CISO? How are you measured today? And what are the things that allow you to be successful, or the things that you strive to do to be successful in your role?
I'll take that one first, I guess. So the three main objectives for me are to obviously make our business secure, remediate real risk, and also manage the perception publicly of that risk and how secure we are, coupled with selling, right? So security as part of the sales cycle is very important for compliance in academia, but also our customers, are very international. So they have very real security concerns about leveraging a software as a service platform that does so much data processing that is based in the United States. So because of that, all three of these goals here kind of overlap one another, but each one of them is discrete in that it requires a different type of management style.
Yeah, being a CISO out there is not an easy job, and I think people in the security industry can kind of attest to it. It's nerve-wracking. When we talk about best practices for a CISO, and the top three things really to make sure that you're successful is, number one, you have to have a good set of goals, and they have to be tied to the organization's goals and missions, right? So from a security perspective, you have to define what your targets are. Every company, every organization is different. So defining those is really that first goal, that first mission. The second thing then is, okay, now you have to control risk, right? And so you have to put those controls in there, and they cover technical, they cover behavioral, as well as process. And it's really about finding that optimal balance between the risks, the costs, and then that friction, either between the employees or even your customers. You want to deal with that usability. Security always comes at a cost in some way, shape, or form. So it's really about establishing those controls, and that would be the second thing. And then lastly, a CISO has to be adaptive, because no matter what you put in today, it's not going to be good enough tomorrow. So you have to have the foresight to understand what are the best practices moving forward. How are the threats adapting, right? And how are you going to stay ahead of that curve? Because as soon as you fall behind, you're in a firefight mode and you will never get the initiative back again. So you have to be forward looking. So those would be my three things. You've got to establish those goals in alignment with the organization's mission and goals, right? If they're in conflict, you won't win. The second, manage those risks through technology, through behaviors, and through process. And then third, be adaptive. You have to look forward. You have to be ready.
Yeah, and Matthew, to follow up on that, you mentioned it's difficult to find that sweet spot in the ROI for mitigation of risk, right? And there's an internal company perception issue associated with that, where a lot of times our security programs are seen as a liability. And a shifting company culture to be security aware makes it easier for security professionals to attain budget and to justify mitigating what we believe is an appropriate amount of risk for the business. That's critical.
Yeah, and it really comes back to that goal. You have to define that target, and you have to work with the executives, to make sure that they're bought into it, because you need their support. Then you need the peer support across the C-level. And once you have that, then you can also go down, right, through the entire organization, all the way to the person that empties out the trash can at night. Everybody's got to be on board. So, but it all starts with that common goal. If you've got disparity there, then you've got conflict, and people aren't going to get bought in, and gaps are going to happen. And that's not what you want when you're managing risk.
So something I want to dive into a bit, because I do find something interesting that you guys both do. And that was in regards to your role. You're basically describing yourselves as business, right? From a security perspective, you have to enable and help grow the business. Jack, you specifically alluded to sales. But in addition to that, you're also trying to mitigate and manage risk. You could also maybe describe as someone acting and facilitating as a gatekeeper. So on one end, you're trying to push and enable, and on the other side, you're kind of being back. How do you navigate that conflicting nature of your role? Because it seems at times it could potentially lap a bit.
So I actually don't see it as a conflict. So, I'm the CISO for a company called Eclipz.io, and, we deal with data security and transport, some great, cool, innovative stuff. But I'm also on advisory boards for a whole bunch of other companies and organizations and whatnot. And I also consult out to, boards of directors and other advisory boards. And the conversation is really around cyber represents a risk to your business, your profitability, your goals. And it really should be, as Malcolm Harkins, a cohort of mine, would say, you need to protect to enable the business. And that's really the viewpoint that the boards and the executives need to take a look. This helps protect and enable your business. because when small or medium businesses, right, some great stats came out last year, 60% of small and medium businesses that experience a cyber attack, a significant one, go out of business within 2 years. So that jeopardizes your entire organization. So security is here to help you. It's an investment that has to be done to protect your assets, your customers, and your future. So we're all on the same side. And if there's an organization where they look at security as not on the same side in supporting business objectives, the CISO is not doing their job, because that needs to be the narrative, and that needs to be how they've aligned their program to help everybody.
Yeah, that's 100% spot on. And one of the things I'll say even more pragmatically, right? Now, obviously managing risk is going to prevent catastrophic incidents and issues. But even in the short term, a lot of times that can enable the business in itself. And if we consider the gating process for vendor onboarding, right? And this is a huge problem. This is why we have things like security scorecard to constantly vet the data security practices of our data processors. The vendor onboarding process is seen as the CISO sticking his fingers in everything and getting involved in things that they shouldn't necessarily be doing. At Turnitin, I have approved Kung Fu lessons in our Newcastle office. I approved the distribution of chocolate Santas in our Utrecht office in the Netherlands. I get in front of every single vendor that we onboard. I do like a few hundred a year. And I have a data sensitivity classification form. Now consider this, you're a customer of Turnitin, and you want to see these processes being audited to make sure that your data is safe. One of the things that an employee could do if there were no oversight, if I weren't standing in between them and their ability to send data to a vendor, they might say, hey, I've got 1.5 billion essays in this database. I'm going to take a few hundred million of them, and I'm going to send them off to do some machine learning with some third-party data processor who might not have a good security program. That would be in direct violation of GDPR, right? Because they're using the data for a purpose for which it was not intended to be used by the consumer. These are all things that would make our customers very unhappy if they discovered, and they would discover those doing their audit when renewal time came around. So by me standing in front of the business and managing those risks, I'm actually enabling the business to function better and to attain more customers by disabling certain people who are acting negligently within our organization.
Yeah, and that trust, right? That goodwill with customers is one, it's a competitive advantage, right? Because if your competitors aren't doing it and they're bleeding data and causing data breaches and so forth, and you're not, right? That gives you a competitive advantage. The other thing is it builds into the cyber ethics. And we're seeing that become more and more important across the industry as well. Organizations that have declared what their cyber ethics are and put in the controls and woven that into their business process and security controls, right? See a more consistent position when it comes to security, when it comes to building trust, right? And, having goodwill, not only with their customers, but also with their suppliers and vendors, people upstream and downstream from them. So that again builds on the reputation of the organization. And a lot of what we do at a macro level is really around making sure digital technology is trustworthy. Right? And think about that. That's really important as we move and evolve as a species and start embracing more and more digital technology and weaving it into our world and relying upon it. So everything we're talking about, whether it be security or ethics or making sure privacy is there or safety, it all circles around to making sure that people can trust technology.
Yeah, and it is a key differentiator, right? And at Turnitin, we actually advertise Turnitin as differentiated by our privacy and security practices, which we hold very highly. So I 100% agree. By being a secure business, especially with the current trends in education technology right now, there's been a lot of data breaches, and there's been a lot of increased security concerns from our customers. That key differentiator is helping the business out a ton, and that's gotten recognition from the CEO of Turnitin. We have recently prioritized security initiatives as top company priorities, which from a cultural perspective is pretty remarkable, because any security professional knows that's the coup de grace, man. That's like the best you can get. When your stuff's getting prioritized for security and you haven't had a data breach, you're doing okay.
Yeah. I mean, moving forward, protecting data is really what it's about, right? Especially when we look at the huge influx of IoT devices and IIoT devices. You're talking tens of billions of more added just in the next couple of years. And you pile that on to the next billion users that are being connected to the internet. You've got tremendous amounts of data that can be aggregated and correlated. And it's just amazing, right? And so protecting data, whether it's at rest, in transit, and use, it's crucial to that trust element.
And I think this is a good way into the human element, because you talk about how security private is actually a business enabler for you, and it helps you differentiate. But in order to achieve that level of differentiation with security, it's not something you can achieve alone, right? This is something that you have established across your business to be able to boast a differentiation of your technical security practice. So let's talk a little bit about the human element and how you're able to achieve that. Jack, we'll start with you. Why is cybersecurity culture important, and what challenges do organizations, whether they're large or small, public or private sector, face?
So I have experience working for older companies, companies that are 20 or so years old. These are tech companies that are doing operational optimization. And with that means that we have an inherently low investment in security personnel, because these security personnel are generally seen as G&A roles. So because of that, I need people from across the company to contribute to security. And furthermore, I don't have the staff to constantly police these folks. So I need to motivate them in a more positive way rather than a policing way. And the way I do that is when I build a security program, and I've greenfielded security programs for dozens of businesses, the first thing I always do is security awareness training. And I'm not just saying that because Theo's here with Right Hand, but it's an inexpensive way to say, hey, I'm here and security is important, and pay attention to all the rest of the shit that I do. It's very inexpensive, and it can be fun. It can also be really, really boring. So the strategies that I've used in the past generally revolve around phishing campaigns. At IAC, we did a phishing campaign with the inside of a refrigerator where we said there has been food theft in our Oakland office. And do you want me to share that picture, Theo?
You can, sure.
Yeah.
If you'd
All
like,
right.
yeah.
I have it up here. So this is the one I did at Turnitin. So rather than just paraphrase, I'll show you guys. This was the phishing email, the one I sent to TII. And we said, to prevent food theft in the Oakland office, we've installed a security camera to monitor for break room, refrigerator, in case people are stealing things. This is ridiculous here. This is the picture of the inside of a refrigerator. The light's on, that light turns off when the door closes. This is just completely asinine, and it's not sent from a company email domain that we own. There's a lot of indicators that this is ridiculous. But if we look on this slide right here, you can see that I had 18% or 8% of my company enter their credentials into the website. So what happened in this instance is that people realized immediately after getting phished that how vulnerable they were, because this is so silly. And then when I did my inceptive presentation at the company introducing security, I would pull that slide up and say, look at all you fallen for this refrigerator thing. When I did it at IAC, we caught people globally. I mean, we caught half of our Stockholm office with this. And I would fly around from business to business and give presentations to these companies and say, what are you guys doing? Like that interested in what's in the Oakland refrigerator? And it really had an impact because it caught their attention. And once I caught their attention, I could send them softer things, more policy certifications or regular security awareness training, with fun things sprinkled in there. But it's really about this shock and awe initial campaign that's fun. It motivates people to pay attention to what we're doing. And then I can utilize the human resources that want to volunteer on security projects. I can utilize this movement of security culture and harness this momentum, keep it going, and get everybody at the company to contribute and prioritize my security requests. And eventually, it doesn't take very long, people are excited about security. They approach me all the time, whereas before, they would be afraid to disclose things. They realize I'm a laid back guy, right? If they come to me and tell me about a concern, about a risk, maybe they've been hacked or phished and they're embarrassed about it, I make them feel like they don't need to be, and I make myself very approachable. because in reality, I am very approachable. I'm just demonstrating that. So all of these things combined really motivate this cultural shift. And then we're talking a very small, financial investment here. Then the big spending comes when I work on infrastructure security initiatives or application security trainings. The bigger things that we think of as typical with security programs, those come in after the fact, and they cost a lot of money, and the ROI is still good, but it's not as good as the awareness training stuff.
And there's a couple things I definitely want to come back to, Jack. But before I do that, I'll pass it over to Matthew with the same question. Why is cybersecurity important, Matthew? What challenges do organizations, large or small, public or private sector, face on this topic?
Well, if we look at it strategically, and it's important actually for everybody in an organization to kind of understand the concept. And unfortunately, cybersecurity is often looked at as simply technical controls. We're going to put on a firewall or anti-malware, and that's going to take care of us. In reality, think of cybersecurity as a coin. And on one side, you have those technical capabilities, those technical controls. But on the other side, you have the behavioral controls, the people, right? And in between is the process that kind of connects them. But you can't separate the behaviors from the technology. In fact, you need them both. There's no way to be scalable without the technology. But when it comes down to it, you can put in the very best firewalls and anti-malware and any technical control you can imagine. And if you have a user that is making poor decisions, they're going to circumvent that. So all your security controls can be undermined by a person. And again, we see it at the lowest level, the brand new employee, in the help desk, all the way up to the senior executives. So behavioral controls, working with the people, is hugely important. You cannot, in today's age, have a competent cybersecurity program without having security savvy or at least educated users, because their poor decisions will undermine everything else that you do, no matter how well you do it. So it's important for everybody to be involved. And a lot of times when I'll go in and I'll talk, I'll sit down with a board, or I'll, go in and sit down with executives or even employees of companies or organizations, I'll ask, okay, who's here? Who's responsible for security? Right? And you get the CISO, putting his head down and his hand up. And I said, no, I don't think you understood me. Who here is responsible for security? I expect everybody's hand is up, because everybody has a role. And in that one question, and I see how many people have their hands up, I already know what the challenges are, right? If nobody but the DevSecOps and the CISO has their hands up, I turn to the CEO, right? And say, you don't have a culture. Everybody's hand should be up here, because everybody has a role to play, even if it's just to make good decisions, to not click on that phishing, to not accept that USB drive at the conference, right? It's all those things. And without it, the two people that had their hands up, they will fail. No matter how much money you give them, no matter how much you empower them, they will fail. And you don't want them to fail, right? So it's time to make sure everybody knows that they have a responsibility. So once everybody knows that, now we can start addressing those behaviors. We can start training and empowering users. And it's not only to prevent bad things from happening, you can also use them to detect, right? As an early warning, canaries, that the end users are great at that, right? To detect, and they're crucial in many cases to be able to effectively respond when something bad happens. So they fill out the entire cycle of prediction, prevention, detection, and response. And to be honest with you, and I've done over 120 different acquisitions, right? When I was with Intel, I managed all the security for all of Intel's acquisitions, right? I would rather have a security savvy employee base than a stack of firewalls. I really would. And I've been in and advised hundreds and hundreds of companies and government agencies and so forth around the world, not just in the US, all over the globe. And that behavioral security is a key component to success. And I'll say it again, you cannot have a successful cybersecurity program without the help, the support, and the good behaviors of the users.
Very clear, very clear. But now we're going to dive into some details, guys. I want to learn about the how, right? So Matthew, you talk about implementing behavioral controls to complement technical controls. Jack, you talked about changing culture through encouragement, empowerment of your user workforce. My follow-up question is, how do you do that, right? If someone on the call today that is potentially moving into a senior leadership role, a CISO position, or potentially wants to move into that CISO position, and they want to establish that cyber culture that you guys speak of, how can they actually influence those behavioral controls and encourage and empower their workforce?
I have a
Let's start with
process that
Matthew.
Oh, we start Matthew. All right.
Or
Okay.
go with Matthew first. It's fine.
Again, first and foremost, you have to have a goal, right? If you can't communicate the goal, if you don't have the buy-in, you're really not going to go anywhere. So again, those are table stakes. Got to have the goals. It has to be clear and people can understand it. Okay, so once you have that, now it's really about educating and empowering those users. And we'll start with the employees. They're important, but also, well, what about contractors and interns? Absolutely. What about suppliers and vendors? Sure. And even customers in some cases, especially for service organizations, even they need to have some level of training and awareness. So having a formal training program for those kinds of different audiences where it makes it fun and easy to learn, and most importantly, relevant to them, right? When I talk to frontline managers, for example, about security policies and controls, why we have them, it's really about, hey, we have these in place so that your employees, their machines don't blow up or their data doesn't get destroyed or your service or your servers don't go down. And that's very relevant to them, right? I talk to finance and I say, hey, these security controls make sure that the integrity of your data doesn't get changed. Someone doesn't change a decimal place. The finance guys really hate that, right? They really hate the integrity going out the window. I talk to the HR people and say, hey, you know, these controls, they protect the confidentiality of your HR records. And that's golden to them. They would rather have downtime than, you know, lose the confidentiality of payroll or HR records or things of that sort. You talk to IT and it's all about uptime for them, right? Hey, this is really going to help make sure that you don't have downtime of your users, so you don't get 500 calls to your help desk, that you're not cleaning up ransomware for the next 3 weeks, 24 hours a day, right? So making it relevant. And for all users, and I'll go back to, you know, what Jack was talking about, right? Phishing training is actually one of the best things that you can do as well. Why? It is a predominant threat vector from external attacks. So yes, have a phishing program, show people and work with them, phish them, and then give them the results. But one thing that I would say in all this kind of training and communication is make sure that you're not the cop, right? Because if you're seen as that enforcement, as the cop, I'm the bad guy, I'm gonna, you know, drop the hammer on you, there becomes less partnership, and you really need that partnership. You need them to feel free to communicate. As you know, Jack was saying, hey, he wants to be approachable. Well, that's great, because when somebody does make a mistake, and people will, everybody does, you want that person to feel comfortable to pick up the phone and call you. Hey, I screwed up. I just hit this. I knew it as soon as I hit that link, right? But that gives you an early detection insight, and you can go in and clean it up before it gets bad. So we need to make sure that it's about partnership and enablement, not just about I'm the cop and I'm gonna slam you down, I'm gonna write you up and you get a ticket or whatever. It's not about that. It's really about empowering that, because a CISO is one person. They can't control everything. We need the cooperation. So you have to build that into your training, into your phishing programs, in the way you communicate, and even have regular you know, information or communication, a newsletter, right? Add something into the corporate newsletter or into the quarterly, you know, information that gets passed down into employees. It's really important. And again, it's got to be partnership. And once you have that, now you've got a community that will be raising their hand and say, yeah, I play a role. Yes, I'm part of the security program and I make this company better. I protect my own system and data, right? But I also do it on behalf of the rest of the company and the shareholders and everybody else. and you've got to build that culture. Culture is the foundation. That's your target. It's not one training class. It's not somebody to check the box off and say, I took that class. I spent my 30 minutes every 6 months or once a year, done. No, you actually need to weave that in to what they're doing in day-to-day actions. Otherwise, it's not meaningful.
Yeah, those are
Jack,
excellent points.
same to you, please.
Yeah, so yeah, those are excellent points. Absolutely the theme of the things that I do. I have a kind of a checklist, a pragmatic set of things. The first thing when joining a company as a new CISO, make yourself known, right? And the way I do that is by a fun phishing campaign. I did a fun one that was Burglary 101 at Turnitin, where I found someone whose badge was left unattended on their desk. I cloned it with a badge reader. I put together some pictures of this whole process, and then my IT team put on masks and they did a cute video of them stealing laptops. We sent that out to the entire company. People loved it. It makes me known. Now I follow up by getting ahead of onboardings. So I onboard every employee in groups, of course, about security, and I custom cater those onboarding sessions to talk about the relevant security things that I can do for them and that they can do for me in their roles. So if it's an engineer, I'll talk about application security. If there's somebody in sales, I'll talk about how I can help them out with their prospects and with renewals, those sort of things. I'll emphasize that we're best in breed in security and that it's okay to tell people that because I'll back it up. After onboarding, the security awareness trainings come in. They're useful if they're done right. And phishing campaigns, as Matthew mentioned, I think are one of the most pragmatic, simple ways to do that. The periodic 30 minutes of training that's required to tick a box is not very pragmatic and useful. This is a weird one. So you have to garner support from a bunch of different types of business areas, right? And one of them is that exec team, or let's just say everybody who is influential at the company. Those people are inherently at risk for being extorted, for being impersonated, and for being harassed. So I provide a service at Turnitin and at other businesses and to friends and family where I do, it's kind of like a background check, but not like an FCRA background check because that would be bad territory. But what I do is I look for exposure, dark web exposure, data breach exposure. I look for information that I can obtain from people online. And what I do is I put together a little docket, a little portfolio of some things I can find out about you. And I do this very confidentially. We don't use company channels to talk about it. And the things that I find are, they're bad. They're really, really bad. These are things that shock people. They're like, holy shit, can we get rid of this? And the answer some of the time, of course, is yes, and some of the time it's no. But the theme is that this is how important security is to our influential people. And those influential people then start to prioritize security because they've seen a personal attachment to it. That one is extremely effective, but it's also incredibly risky because we're talking about very, very influential people. So if you're starting in a leadership role in security and you do this to the wrong person, you might find a saboteur on your hands. So something that you have to navigate with a lot of social charisma and be very careful about whom you're dealing with. Other than that, a lot of the initiatives involve exposure of risk. So one of the things that I can do is deploy some software into a cloud environment, something like Orca or something, and expose that there are very pragmatic risks. And I'm not talking about running some vulnerability scanner that's going to surface 843,000 issues, but I'm talking about something that's going to expose real risks, real things that need to be worked on. Penetration tests can do this. And this kind of shows people that aside from being a flashy dude and talking all this talk, I can also walk the walk. I have to show that there are pragmatic things that need to be tackled at the business to sell the analytical types, right? And I work in tech, as most of us do. And so we are mostly dealing with those analytical types. So that, I mean, I get their attention over here, but I don't want them to think that I'm just some pointy haired dude, who gets up and pretends that I know about security. I also have to put my money where my mouth is. So that's a pretty good checklist of things that you can do to get started. That can be all done at a medium-sized 500 to 1,000 person business. You can accomplish all of that with $100,000 in a capitalized first-year expense.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned, Jack, which I think is hugely important, is really that first day and even last day office process where you're doing training, you're interacting with the with the either new employee or either the employee that's leaving the company, both has its value when it comes to security awareness and understanding roles and responsibilities and expectations and so forth. So, you know, the earlier you can get into somebody that's joining the company, the better. And unfortunately, I've seen it some, especially large corporations. A new hire comes in, and day one, they're given a laptop, they're given rights and permissions. However, they're not going to even receive security training for 6 months. And so they're creating problems unknowingly, not intentionally, right, for 6 months. And so timing is also very, very important, right? And for those employees that are leaving the company, they've had probably access to all sorts of data, both in digital and physical form, and making sure that they understand that, you know, that information is proprietary and, you know, needs not to be, you know, shared and so on and so is also real important to make sure that even after they're gone, there isn't a problem. So, you know, on both ends, both bookends really need to be addressed.
Yeah, and that onboarding is a great way to establish initial relationships too. Like
Yeah.
just aside from security, like get advocates, right? Every once in a while, somebody will come out of those who is just so stoked about security.
Yeah, they become your champion. I love identifying those. That
Yeah.
equally, I also like going in and meeting somebody who is just, you know, they're going to be a problem, right? They either think they know a lot more, so they don't really need to do security. Engineering types sometimes fall into this. Senior executives sometimes fall into this. And you know, you just need to work a little bit more to communicate with them so that they understand what the actual issues are and how consistency and comprehensiveness to the corporate security policies are very important, even at their level.
Yeah, code switching is key with
Yes,
that too,
coaching.
Right? Well,
that's what we call it, coaching. Yes.
Yeah. What I'll do is I'll put on my engineer hat for the engineer guys, and I'll put on my, you know, other hat for the sales folks and my executive hat for the execs. But it's really important to feel your audience out. That's really important, right? Yeah.
Yeah. That's part of that behavioral, right? I mean,
So
you have to connect with people.
So you guys have done a good job of kind of creating a journey here for a new CISO potentially moving into a senior security leadership role. You shared a little bit about what different practices someone can implement, how they can really weave themselves in company's DNA to weave security into the company. The next step, now that a CISO has implemented some of these practices that you've shared, what can people do to raise engagement? Because Jack, you alluded to this at the very beginning of this webinar. Our industry, from a cybersecurity awareness perspective, has been plagued with boring content, right? I think just about everybody on this call, I'm sure that everyone has been through those mandatory multi-hour training courses where you have to sit on your computer and press next, right? All of us have been through this. And it's not necessarily something that you get extremely excited about. If you're in sales, if you're in finance, if you're in marketing, you have a job description that doesn't necessarily read cybersecurity anywhere on it, right? But you're being asked to dedicate time out of your day instead of chasing a purchase order or working on a procurement cycle. You are now being tasked on cybersecurity matters. So my question is, how do you increase engagement? How do you make it not boring to really reach more of your audience?
So, I mean, you know the answer to that, Theo, but for the audience, I put together those videos on different platforms in the past, and they are horrible, some of them. At Turnitin, I fell asleep at my desk 3 times while reviewing all of these different videos, because I mean, if I'm putting together 2 hours worth of content, I got to watch 10. And so you think it's bad watching it when you're being trained, try putting like curating that stuff? Nah, I'm good. So Theo's built these micro learnings, and the micro learnings are really cool because they accomplish they accomplish exactly what the points I need to get across in very brief ways that people can consume slowly over time. If you've ever taken a sexual harassment training, for example, which is generally more rigorous and strict than security awareness training, whenever you click away for a minute from the video, a lot of these platforms will rewind you. You have to kind of get it done in a single sitting. And me personally, in order for me to do that, I have to block an amount of time on my calendar off that would require 3 weeks in advance. So not everybody has a calendar like that, but for those of us that are doing things like that, which is a lot of businesses and a lot of people in a lot of businesses, having these smaller consumable trainings are the way to go. If we're satisfying compliance, a lot of times your auditors will be happy with just phishing emails coupled with a little bit of training. There's also onboarding sessions, as I mentioned before. Those can satisfy compliance. Presentations to the company can satisfy compliance. These are all things that you can do for awareness training that make them more fun and more human. The one thing that I would not recommend doing is sitting somebody in front of a 20-minute long GDPR video with vector graphics and a robotic voice. That doesn't always sync up to those vector graphics.
And Matthew, do you also want to share a little bit about what best practices to make it more engaging, cyber awareness more engaging and more fun?
Yeah, so I'll actually go down 2 different paths here. And the first path is about that content, right? Worst case is to make it boring and annoying and confusing. You're not going to get people's attention. They're not going to apply it. And it's just over their head, right? They don't care. And it doesn't matter. And it truly doesn't matter to them, right? The next step up is if you can make it entertaining, at least you get their attention. That's nice. But again, it doesn't necessarily, and we've seen a lot of stats out there that show, okay, great, they paid attention, but they're not actually going to apply it, right? Especially when you've got business activities that may be in conflict with it, right? They're going to go down and, get their job done. Well, even if they do release data or whatever, they're going to secure that contract, right? Okay. The tier above that is you really need to make content relevant to them. They need to understand how their actions help, right? Help their job, help their group, help the company, and how their actions could be a detriment to not only their personal work and career, their group, and, to their company and shareholders or the organization that they support. So you have to add in that relevance factor. Otherwise, you simply don't change behaviors. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want behaviors to be changed. We want them to be more secure, more thought provocative. We want them to question things. We want them to take pause before they're clicking on things or downloading or installing or changing or sharing, right? And so it takes a behavioral change. And the only way you do that is through relevance. So if you can get it and make it both interesting and entertaining to capture their attention, as well as very relevant to their work and their goals, now you've got that right combination to actually shift behaviors, which is not an easy thing to do. Ask any psychologist or sociologist, it's not easy to do. Okay, so that's one vector. The other vector is to work with the organization itself to make sure that the managers and the supervisors and the senior managers are talking about security. It's a regular topic. And it should be as part of performance reviews. It should be part of monthly discussions, right, within the groups or the divisions, and even up to the board members when you're talking about quarterly or annual reports and interaction there, and definitely as part of advisory boards. Right? It needs to be part of that because that then trickles and keeps the conversations relevant and it keeps it in the forefront of people's minds. And it gives me no greater joy when I'm listening in to a particular business unit and I hear the manager talking with people and they're asking about sales or they're asking about marketing or they're asking about engineering development. And then all of a sudden that same manager says, yeah, and how are we doing on the security controls there? Did we get that security? Or hey, are we making sure we're marking that data before you send it out in the private NDA marketing folder? Are you sure it's labeled correctly? I just smile, right? Because I'm not even forcing it. It's part of the culture and the management and the employees. And when the employees volunteer, when they give their status report, they throw in something about security or privacy or safety just organically. I know that the behaviors now have changed because it's been part of the day-to-day work and they see it as relevant. So it all comes together at that moment. And you then have that blossoming of a security savvy workforce. So it makes my job easier, right? I can actually drink warm coffee instead of cold coffee. So good stuff.
Awesome. So now taking it a step further through this journey, you have your new CISO, you've taught them what programs to implement. You've shared some best practices on how to increase engagement. Matthew, you talked about customizing content, making content more useful for the user. So now this new CISO who has made a very custom fit cyber awareness program specific for their organization and their user base. And then 2020 hits, right? And this new CISO is hit with a ton of new challenges that was not anticipated at all when they were getting ready for planning at the end of 2019. What guidance would you give to someone in a senior lead role, Matthew and Jack, in regards to how they can navigate something like that we've experienced this year? Matthew, you talked a lot about the importance of adaptivity early on in this webinar. What's the role of adaptivity in regards to the shift that we've seen in the cyber landscape this year?
Well, 2020 has thrown a wrench into everybody's plan in every country, organization, and whatnot. But the one person I don't feel sorry for is actually the CISO, because the reality is every day for every CISO, it's chaotic anyway, right? We're always dealing with the unknowns of unknowns. And so we are used to that ambiguity. We are used to the last minute changes, and we are used to, hard right turns, without getting any kind of warning. So to be a good CISO, you have to have that ability to adapt. And so it should really be just another day. Now, it really isn't, right, for CISOs, because it changes. But, from a mentality perspective, yep, this is the next challenge I'm going to deal with. Starting today, it's going to take some time. But when we look at the fundamental changes now that has driven, especially working from home or working remotely, practically speaking, the CISO now has to address all sorts of other challenges, right? And again, it falls into that technical, it falls into the behavioral and the process space. And obviously from the technical space, you need people to be able to remotely connect and transfer data securely and all those kinds of things. Great, that's a lot of technical stuff with VPNs or newer software, ZTNA, zero trust, all those kinds of things. But on the behavioral side, you also have to adapt as well. Because if you think about it, when we step into an office, and imagine going into office and sitting at your desk or your cubicle and you're around other employees and you have this culture that's set, right? You're not going to hand a USB stick and plug it into your system that you found on the floor. You're not going to do those kinds of things, right? You're not going to just, share data inappropriately. However, when you take that person out of that professional work environment with other people around you who are also acting in a secure manner, and you put them into a really safe, warm, comforting environment, let's say home, where they're still in their pajamas and it's safe. This is my network, my PC, it's safe. The behavioral controls then start to slip because we get this perception that we're safe. And yeah, your kid hands you a USB drive and wants to share something with you. Oh, let me just plug it into my work laptop. You wouldn't do that at work. But because you're in a different comfort zone, right, people tend to shift their behavior. So from a CISO's perspective, you have to kind of, again, step forward and reinforce those proper controls, the policies, the best known methods, and remind people, hey, you can't fall in and get, I won't say lazy, but you just can't let it slip. We have to stay on our forefront. And the attackers, they know this. We saw from the very beginning, huge phishing campaigns, right? Targeting keywords around COVID and disease and virus and everything else to lure people in. We saw attacks on home networks. We saw attacks on home PCs. We saw all sorts of traversal attacks and things of that sort. And the attackers knew, hey, go after the end users because they're now at home. They're a little more lax. They're willing to surf a little bit more, maybe in places they wouldn't at work, right? We're going to use that to our advantage. and they did. So communicating that, working with that, understanding how the threats change, how the technology infrastructure changes, adapting your security programs to that, all for the exact same purpose. You're still targeting that optimal level of security that you've defined as part of your goals. It all comes back to that.
Those are great points. And one thing I'm picking up the theme there, and I have to preface this. We wrote a global pandemic entry into our ERA in 2019. So modern technology companies, we're all familiar, have a work from home policy generally, and we have the infrastructure that's suitable to facilitate people working from home. So what I've noticed is that there hasn't been a change in inherent risk, but a change in the likelihood of key risks. Those risks are ransomware attacks, phishing attacks, attacks that target end users. And I think that the reason those risks have increased is because of some global economic crises that are motivating, people who might have had positions that were on the other side of the law to switch to the bad side of the law and start, desperately performing these attacks. And also, as Matthew touched on, there's not that office culture, that pressure to kind of think securely. We're comfortable in our homes, right? And so we tend to not scrutinize things. We're in our pajamas. We're not dressed in the suits or whatever. Not that everybody wears a suit in tech, right? But you get what I'm saying. Those are excellent points. I think the key thing to take away is that because the risks change, the program needs to adapt to prioritize those risks more than it had before. And that could be investments in awareness training. I think that's a very key one that Matthew touched on, a shift in how you're training, what you're focusing on in your training platform, maybe increasing the number of trainings about avoiding ransomware and phishing attacks and malware and safe browsing habits, those sort of things. Also, investment in endpoint detection and response for workstation infrastructure, looking at more solutions that involve password security, using Okta or something like that, some SSO system, enforcing MFA on your VPNs, moving towards a more complex password policy and encouraging multi-use passwords, breach database monitoring for passwords that already exist in your infrastructure, things like that. Better vendor data security is also key in this area because as people are working with third-party vendors, these are often not integrated with corporate infrastructure in a way that is secure and so bypasses those security controls. And having a more solid vendor vetting process can get ahead of things like not having SSO integrated with the key vendor that's processing sensitive data. So these are that's a pragmatic checklist of things you can look at to mitigate the increased risks. But there's also, it's a zero-sum game, the way investment works and the way you invest in risk. Typically, if the general business risk goes up in a marginal way like it has with COVID, we're not seeing a large increase in budget. So in order to invest in these risks, you have to identify other risks to take investments away from. And that's difficult because what I've seen is an increase in risk and not a decrease in other risks. So I don't know, Matthew, if you've seen a decrease in any other risks that we can take funds from our programs. I haven't.
No, I haven't either. And, you touched upon ransomware. In fact, all the social media attacks, but ransomware particularly is going like gangbusters. And, it really comes down to the cyber criminals and they're winning. I mean, let's just be honest about this. They're winning. They're getting tremendous sums of money, which is reinforcing more sophisticated ransomware attacks, the development of new ransomware technologies, entire models, ransomware as a service, which then enables people that have zero technical knowledge to get in and become a cyber criminal and then distribute that and still make money. So, we need to worry about those types of social engineering attacks. And whether it's ransomware that locks up your system and demands, cryptocurrency or something else, or it's simply harvesting the credentials that you have to your email or your work accounts or to access to data storage, right? All those are important because, again, data breaches and it all fits together with what cyber criminals are trying to do, what nation states are trying to do, data harvesters, you name it. So there's a lot of money and power to be gained by the attackers, and it's working. So the risks aren't going down. They evolve, but as they evolve, they continue to get stronger. And that's why you have to stay ahead. You have to understand that those CISOs need to realize, okay, my risk assessment, the factors have changed, as Jack was saying. Okay, let's revisit my risk assessment on home users And okay, the attackers, the threat has gone up and the likelihood has gone up, and now potentially even the impacts have gone up. So that fundamentally changes that end result. How do I then manage that? How do I control that risk to bring it back down to the acceptable level? We never zero out risk. We can never get rid of it all. Again, it's finding that optimal level that's tied to your goals, right? Finding that optimal level, and that's what you're targeting. So yeah, risks don't go down. They
Nope.
go up until you control them.
Yeah,
We've
that's
got-
a good point about. Oh, sorry, Theo. We're running out.
No, I was just gonna. I want to make sure we get to a couple questions from our audience. We have about 3 minutes left, and we've got questions that we want to get to. So I'm going to ask each of you a question as opposed to giving you both the opportunity to answer the same. So this first one's for Matthew. Matthew, do you usually experience a stronger adoption of cyber awareness programs from C-level executives or from mid-level employees? Where do you see stronger level of adoption?
Right, if a CISO is doing their job right, they need to get strong adoption from both. But I would say that you need to focus first on the executives, because if you don't get their buy-in, if they don't understand how important and relevant it is, when people lower in the chain go, hey, the security stuff is taking too much time, or I can't complete this project on time because of security, let me just go around it, right? Those executives will kind of nod their head or they'll look the other way. So you need to make sure that the senior executives are fully bought in and they understand what's at risk and how it ties to their fiduciary responsibility, how it ties to their deliverables, and how it can impact that. So getting their buy-in, I think, is more crucial at first, because then it facilitates the buy-in from everybody downstream and it guarantees it. And if the people downstream don't kind of want to go that direction for whatever reason, you now have that advocate and champion who, well, pays their paycheck, right? And that can be pretty powerful from an influence perspective. So target the executives first, make sure you've got clear buy-in from them, and it will facilitate everything else. It just makes everything else go easier and faster.
Thank you, Matthew. Next question's over to Jack. So it looks like one of our audience members has experienced a security incident, and specifically a security incident that their passwords were breached and they were notified by Google. What best practices could you share for having secure passwords and making sure they're unique and remembered across multi sites? Perhaps, Jack, a more direct question is, do you have some password managers that you would recommend to our audience that they could implement and utilize on a daily basis?
Yeah, I would say just use any reputable password manager, but to keep in mind that what Google is doing is a breach database notification of existing passwords. I have a 25 billion row breach database over here at my home office, and it's imperative that you don't reuse old passwords for websites that were using SHA-256 and hashing, for example. Modern day password cracking does not involve John the Ripper. It involves hash tables, because all the passwords have been cracked. You can pop a password hash into Google and you can find common passwords. That said, use a password manager, integrate with an SSO system wherever you can, use MFA, make sure you're not using old passwords, use multi-word passwords if you're worried about cracking attacks, which you probably shouldn't be. Look for collisions, integrate breach database monitoring into your Active Directory systems. Use Have I Been Pwned APIs if you want to build your own thing. Download breach database compilations and run your own queries against hashes that exist for your employees. But the best answer, I think, to the question is just find a good reputable password manager. Google's is good and it is reputable. What Google is doing there is alerting you of other passwords that have been exposed in breaches. And those are typically very old, because Google's breach database, I believe, uses the Have I Been Pwned API, which it gets things that are fairly new, but not the best and the coolest breach databases.
Yeah, and I'll actually build on
Great.
that as well, because passwords and credentials are really important. The two most important things is to make sure that it's a strong password or credential, and to make sure that you never reuse it, not only in that platform, but don't use it across other platforms. So, and having multi-factor or even, second factor is good, are really good. When we look at password managers, the ones that are embedded in browsers, they're better than no password manager. They're better than trying to remember them because you're going to reuse, right? Or you're going to increment the number. My strong password, and I'm going to change the number from a 1 to a 2. You're not fooling anybody. The password crackers get that, right? They'll figure that out in about a millisecond. But if you want to level up, again, look for those third-party password managers. There's some that are free. There's some that are paid. Find one that you trust. So use a reputable one. There's some ones that aren't reputable. So do your research. And the other one, find one that you like, that you're just going to use. Because if the interface isn't good, you're not going to use it and it doesn't help you, right? It's like a seatbelt. It's great when you're wearing it, but if you're not wearing it, it doesn't help you. So, credential management is one of the important things that every user has a role in, and they can make a fundamental difference.
Excellent. And last question here, and then we do have to close this up. Matthew, it's a question to you. This was a question directed to you based on your previous point you made about Okta for password security. Any best practices to make sure you're taking safest measures to protect your work and personal data aside from password managers?
Well, password managers are great for the end user, but again, for the organization, where you can implement two-factor authentication, or even better, multi-factor authentication, that's great. And it may not be good for all the places unless you're using, a seamless one-time kind of login pass-through capability, which is great as well. But figure out what you do need to protect, right? What is most crucial in your environment, and make sure the credentials around that are sufficient. And when we look at the process, that's a great preventative step. Hugely important. Biggest ROI is the prevention, but not all prevention works. So you also have to have good detective and responsive controls. So when we talk about credential and credential loss, you want to be able to train your users. You want to be able to have systems that can detect unusual logins or malicious logins or things of that sort, and alert the right people so that they then have the capability to respond. And responding may be forcing a password reset. Responding may be checking with that end user through a side channel saying, did you really try and do this? Is this really you? Did you really need access? But you need to have those controls. In worst case, you may need a recovery capability. Hey, the passwords are compromised. Great. We need to go in and shut that system down, and maybe even change the admin passwords if the admin accounts were compromised. The other thing you could do from an organizational perspective is for admins should have separate administrator accounts. You never use your user account when you're an admin to do administrative functions. You always have a separate account with more stringent controls. So, there's lots of things that organizations can do on the preventative, detective, and responsive side. But these are all things organizations can control. This is within your control. So go off and do it. Figure out what's right for you and implement those and justify those and tie those back to your goals.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew. And I know this is a topic that the three in our audience are very passionate about. We are at time. I just want to close this off by thank you to you, Matthew, and thank you to you, Jack, for a fantastic discussion today on the role of cyber culture and a cyber strategy. I want to extend my appreciation to our audience today for setting time aside from their day. I hope you were able to learn and hear some very valuable insights that you can carry back with you in your personal lives and also to your business. I'd like to wish everyone a fantastic rest of their and Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Take care, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks.